So, welcome everyone today for the Food and Agriculture group of the Deep Adaptation Forum. Today we have Tom Bartels. Tom is a prolific gardener in Durango, Colorado, which is a mountain town not generally known for prolific gardens. So, well done. In recent years, he's been focusing a lot on sharing his knowledge and helping others to grow food well. And so in that connection, he's also the founder, I believe, of growfoodwell.com, which is a resource he maintains for helping people figure out how to grow their own food. And that's true for both experienced gardeners who maybe need a little help, but especially new gardeners who just aren't sure where to begin. So Tom, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here. Wonderful group. Love what the group is doing in general. It's a needed resource, so I'm glad to be part of it.
Yeah, we're very glad to have you. I know that the Food and Ag group, we've got a lot of interest in gardening, and there's been a lot of discussions not only on sort of the practical, how do you do it, but also the sort of social aspects of how do you make this a thing in your community. So I think we'll get into some of that. I thought we could maybe start today just by talking about where it all started for you. You've been doing this a long time. How did it all begin? Why and how and when did you start growing your own food?
I've been growing organic biointensive methods in my backyard gardens for about 20 years now. And I kind of got into environmental agriculture or environmental ed 30 years ago and did a lot of video production for government agencies and different entities. And that got me into understanding and quantifying the speed at which we were destroying ecosystems. And it kind of got me bummed out because I was tabulating all the negative data for years and years and producing information on that, which just didn't seem to get me anywhere. It was just depressing to watch how fast we're being stupid. And so I decided to shift and look at only positive behaviors that we could work with to enhance the positive side of the equation. We did a radio show for about 12 years called Good Dirt Radio, which had 5-minute loops that we put on terrestrial radio stations nationwide that had positive behaviors that people could follow in their own communities to start positive actions, whether it be gardens or recycling or what have you. But we did that quite a bunch for 12 years. And then that was concurrent with me learning more and more about methods to help people get through food growing problems. Because most people, when they come up against this, like we're seeing this week, they buy a ton of seeds and they don't quite know what to do with them. So they make a lot of mistakes all at once. They compound all the issues, and to them it's like, this is way too hard, and they give up. And so I was trying to find methods where people could institute some they're old organic methods that aren't like brand new. They've been used for hundreds and hundreds of years, but we've kind of forgotten those techniques. And so I kind of created a hybrid program that shows people how to jump in on those old techniques and how to use some new efficiencies like drip feed irrigation on timers that helps them keep doing their busy lifestyle, but also grow a lot of food pretty easily concurrently with a busy lifestyle and a full-time job. So they don't have to become farmers. They're just people that happen to grow food at home. And it's really common in other countries. My wife and I did the Camino de Santiago hike a couple of years ago across Spain, and the Spanish countryside, even suburban Spain, everyone has backyard gardens that are prolific food production areas. We just culturally in the US have kind of forgotten that and handed it over to corporate agriculture. And so that's part of the issue. And so it's a great retraining process that I kind of jumped into and have been doing that for about 20 years now.
Yeah, so that leads me in nicely to that's a good segue to sort of, the next thing that I thought we might just give people a hint about, which is, right? I mean, everyone has different ways of growing food, and some people know more than others. But maybe just give us a brief overview of what your system looks like You know, how do you manage it? What does a typical sort of growing season look like for you?
I have a 130-day growing season here in we're in the high desert. We're at 6,800 feet, and we have early and late frost, so it's pretty tight on our season. So we have to do a lot of season extension here. Um, but what that did is really stimulate me to get creative and efficient with our methods, so that if we can do it here in this constrained system, people can really do this anywhere. So it creates a nice method that works for anybody, and it's universally applicable. You just adjust your planting dates depending on your growing season, et cetera, and choose maybe some different varieties of plants that happen to be accommodating to your microclimate. Um, but I grow about 1,000 pounds of food in 1,700 square feet, more or less, in 130 days every year. And then we process it, freeze it, ferment it, dry it, store it, et cetera, so we can have that kind of food throughout the year. Um, and then we, of course, save a lot of our open pollinated seeds for the following season, and try to stimulate other people to do the same, because the more we save diversity of seeds and heirloom varieties, the better off we are regionally, because it's adjusting to your microclimate year after year. So you're actually improving that seed for that area, and it also keeps that diversity in play, so that we don't have to rely on monoculture seed companies that may or may not be collecting on that diversity.
So 1,000 pounds, I mean, that seems like quite a bit. Do you market that, or have you ever done sort of market garden type stuff, or is it just all for the family? And if so, how far does that get you? I mean, do you end up with producing most of your own vegetables, and what about fruits and animals and stuff like
Yeah,
that?
we have about 8 fruit trees, and I have about 9 laying hens. So, and I've been eating a plant-based, mostly vegetarian diet since 1983, I guess. So over 30, 35 years or so. And so I get protein from the hen eggs and legumes and nuts and everything else. But as far as overall how much it takes to grow your own food, it takes a larger area than people would expect. Even though I'm growing 1,000 pounds of nutrient-rich organic vegetables and fruits included in that: apples, cherries, apricots, peaches, plums, strawberries, what else? Some other small currant bushes and stuff. But we each eat about 2,000 pounds of food overall each year, each one of us. So between my wife and I, we need about 4,000 pounds roughly of food for a standard diet. So I'm growing basically 1/4 of our food needs as far as vegetables and fruits on our 1,700 square feet. It's quite a small area, but I grow intensively. So there's a lot of nutrition per square foot. We don't waste a lot of space. And we get a really dense, nutrient-dense crop out of that space because of the soil and the soil food web being so active here. And that's part of the methods that we teach in the program.
Yeah. So how long have you been cultivating that 1,700 square feet? I mean, are you decades into that, or
Yeah, we're 20 years in now.
into that same plot?
Yeah, yeah.
That's amazing. I mean, that means that the soil is remaining healthy and not being depleted. That's
Yeah.
the definition of sustainable, I think.
Well, not only is it
20
not
years,
depleted, it's improved every year for 20 years.
right?
Don't add, there's no pesticides, there's no herbicides, there's no external fertilizer except for compost made on site and worms and leaves and carbon materials for 20 years. I rarely use manure, mostly because of herbicide carryover in a lot of manures. In our county, create a closed loop system here where I only take clean carbon or refuse from the garden or anything that comes in through the house via grocery bags of anything we do buy at the store. We try to buy all organic so that when we have scraps or leftovers, 100% of it goes into the worm bins or compost. That cycles through. And so each year, consequently, with cover crops and this composting cycling, our soil improves and gets more and more fertile. So 20 years of that shouldn't deplete it. It should be incredibly stellar, which is what happens when you institute these methods, which does a couple of things. It creates more nutrition in your food because the micronutrients are so readily available for the plants that they just grow to their full genetic potential. And the second thing is it creates less work for you because it's easier. You use less water to irrigate the crops. And because of the density of what you're growing and how it's planted, you only have to weed once a year. And so it makes it easier and easier each year. And it's kind of embarrassing. It's actually lazier type of gardening down the road because you start early with all this work that then compounds success and it becomes easier each year.
Well, so I mean, that raises, I think, maybe the main question on a lot of people's minds, which is how, so how do people get started? What's your, I mean, this is what you've been doing a lot of lately is trying to figure out how to help people get started. So,
Sure.
what's the 5-minute version of sort of where do people begin? I think a lot of people looking out there, probably a lot of people watching this today and on the recording are not gardeners, but have a
Right.
backyard or have access to, a few hundred or maybe even a few thousand square feet.
Sure.
Where to?
Well, in general, we have an incredible opportunity. The largest irrigated crop in the United States is lawns. We have 40 million acres of lawns in the United States. It's the largest irrigated crop. We have the irrigation in place right outside everyone's door. We're using it poorly. We're oversaturating it with pesticides and herbicides because people don't understand quantities of dosage. So it tends to be the most toxic crops and soil out there. We can change that. If we transferred 5-10% of that, we'd have millions and millions of pounds of great food right outside people's doors. And this most recent scenario with the COVID-19 shows that if you don't have to panic buy food if it's outside your door, or if you've been growing it for years right in your yard and you have some frozen, stored, dried, fermented, however you want to process it, then you put this slack in the system and people don't react with fear so much because they're connected with their food source. But as far as first time out, if you have a lawn, you got to rip your lawn out. Typically use a sod cutter to cut 7 inches down, take that, flip it in place. In late fall is actually the optimal time because you can flip it in place, put some clean manure if you can find some, or some compost underneath it to kind of generate some bacterial movement on the upside down grass. The roots will die over the winter, and that internal part of the grass will turn into really active soil, and then you start out double digging your soil the next spring. If you don't have that timeline, you can still cut out your grass and flip it upside down and compost it. You have to flip it upside down or otherwise it'll regrow, and those roots are pretty persistent. You can also start from the ground up. A lot of people like putting raised beds in, which does take a little bit more work with framed raised beds because of all the wood and materials involved. I have some of those, but I also like the ease of in-ground beds because you don't have any infrastructure to purchase or take care of for years. It just works in open ground. You just have to start kind of working your soil initially into the ground you have. A lot of this depends on whoever it is, what their soil looks like to begin with. If you have really, really bad soil, it's just gravel or it's 100% clay, or there's all kinds of scenarios. You may have to mitigate that by bringing soil on site and compost on site to start out. And there's a lot of latitude for first year gardeners that can't use the most optimal methods because they're starting with really bad soil. So during that first year, it's very circumstantial depending on their scenario. But basically, you have to get a bed about 2 feet deep. It would be optimal. Most people don't understand how deep plants can actually propagate in really good amended soil. But 2 feet is what I recommend for most gardeners. And you can go 2 feet up or 2 feet down, depending on your scenario. You want to collect as much organic matter as possible through compost, worm bins. One of the easiest things for worm bins is skip the whole propensity to start with a plastic bin in your garage, which a lot of people do because it's easy, or a plastic worm bin. They tend to break over time. They freeze in the winter. There's no insulation. There's all kinds of issues with them that make them temporary. And if you're really going to jump into this and looking long-term, 5, 10 years out, go ahead and get out to a junkyard and find any old refrigerator or freezer. Optimal is a top-loading old freezer from the 70s, the 80s. They're sitting out by the millions in junkyards. They're free typically, or $20. You pull the old Freon units out, and they become perfect worm bins year-round. We get 600 pounds of worm castings out of our bin every year from 2 people from kitchen scraps. It's superfood for your plants. It's an amazing compost. It's lazy compost, so you only add, every 2 or 3 days, you have a little compost bucket on your shelf. You start that and you throw it in the worm bin, and they typically eat that within that 2 or 3 days and process it. So unlike compost, where you do everything all at once and you turn an entire compost pile, and then it sits for weeks or months, in the case of a worm bin, it's designed for human behavior, where every 2 or 3 days you have kitchen scraps. Perfect. Dump that in the worm bin, forget about it, close the lid. Even in the winter, they don't freeze because these are pre-insulated boxes, basically. And there's ways you can create, if you're in a really cold environment, like we have sometimes below 0 temperatures Fahrenheit for a week at a time. And my worm bin does fine because I put what's called I call a biofurnace with coffee grounds in the middle of the bin material, and it actually generates heat for about 3 weeks and keeps the worms from getting too cold. So they stay active all winter long, and in spring, you're pulling out this finished worm castings, which goes from anywhere from $1 to $3 a pound for worm castings, depending on where you buy it. So the more you can generate that stuff on site, the better off you are. And then, of course, compost, both in traditional compost bins, are wonderful. You should have those eventually set up. If you don't first year, you want to start doing that yourself because it's free. It's a great resource to have because it's going to regenerate that fertility every year. And it's a really critical part of the closing the cycle of gardening. So those are 2, a few quick tips, but and there's a million other variables, but all this being said, what it does is reteaches people the nuances of supporting a natural systems approach to providing the conditions for plants that they need to grow with an uninterrupted plant cycle, an uninterrupted growth cycle for that particular plant. And what we typically do as beginning gardeners is we forget to water those germinating carrots for 2 days, right when they were germinating, and they all dry out. And we're interrupting that plant cycle. Or we don't understand transplanting. So we take a plant that we've taken care of for 6 weeks under the lights, put it out in the garden at the wrong time, and we don't harden them off. They go into transplant shock, and then you have this dip in the growth cycle, and right there is where pests and disease can attack that weakness. So once you align with these subtleties and understand how to keep the conditions in the garden to the point where the plants just love it, you can basically back out of the way, and there's very little for you to do except kind of manage and check on things, right? You don't have to micromanage. So you come in, you weed once a year, and then you're done. You check on things and you make sure your irrigation system is operating on the timer, and otherwise you're kind of obsolete, which is great. You can leave for weeks at a time, and I commonly do. Sometimes I leave for a month, and I have 17 to 20 beds that don't need me. I come back, it's just bigger plants. Nobody has to take care of the garden, which I think is one of the fears people have on starting a garden is, I have to dedicate my whole summer. I can't leave. It's like, no, it's not true. If you design it right, set it up, it's not expensive. You just have to understand how to maintain that. And big part of that, of course, is having what's called a very robust soil food web, which is under the soil, what's happening with your microorganisms. And that's the key to most of the methods that we're using.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that again, thanks for the perfect segue there, because I think that's something we haven't covered in detail yet, but I think that might be interesting. And just to recap quickly on sort of what you were talking about just now, and just to sort of state it a different way, just for anyone who's listening, I heard you say that, if you've got healthy plants, then you don't really need pesticides. You don't need herbicides. The plants take care of themselves when they're healthy.
Mm-hmm.
They have their own natural defenses. And as long as you can give them the health that they need to bring those defenses to bear, they'll take care of themselves. And then, of course, the watering, which is, something you can automate. And I know you sort of alluded to that. But of course, soil also is a major part of that health equation. And soil is also, there's been quite a bit of talk in the forum, not just about people gardening for reasons of resiliency or reconnection, or just fun, but also there's this notion of carbon sequestration and the potential for soil to play a big role there. And that all then is sort of links together and ties up with the notion of healthy soils and their role in promoting healthy plants. So what do you think about the soil part of this equation? Clearly it's a big deal.
Well, let me, to further expedite that and help people understand, if I can share this visual, I think that would help. Is that good
Yeah,
for now?
by all means.
Let me jump in here. You should be able to see some stuff. Can you see a teaspoon of soil there?
I see it at the bottom, yep.
Okay.
There it is.
Is it
Now it's
big enough?
centered. Yeah.
Great. Oh, so it centers on the screen like that. There we go. So in a teaspoon of average healthy garden soil, there's 1 billion bacteria and 10,000 different species in active, good, healthy garden soil. We have cataloged, or the scientists, the soil scientists have cataloged about 5% of it. So 95% of those species we haven't even identified and done taxonomy on it yet. But it's fungi and protozoa and nematodes, microarthropods, there's all kinds of stuff that is an interrelated community down there, and that's the baseline food chain of what's called the soil food web. And so this soil food web is what runs basically all of my gardens. And what happens, it's kind of magic. And if, for those of you that don't know what happens with exudates in plants, this is how forests grow, and this is how plants have this symbiotic relationship that is 500 million years old, this relationship with bacteria and fungi. It's one of the oldest system relationships on the planet, and it's how initially we got our oxygen for our atmosphere and everything from original, the cyanobacteria from 3.6 billion years ago, and that's an entirely different story. But basically what we have here is in the rhizosphere, which is the tips of all the roots underground, the plants have this ability to take photosynthesis from sunlight. They turn sunlight into food. They release pure oxygen, which is to our benefit, take the CO2 or the carbon and put it into carbohydrates and generate simple proteins and carbohydrates, which they release, and they actually jettison this into the soil. And this is how plants sequester carbon into the soil. This is the biggest way they do so. There are other ways above the soil and with composting, but this is the most efficient. And this is how a tree not only will sequester carbon in its trunk, in the mass, but it's constantly sending and jettisoning carbon into the soil in the form of simple proteins and carbohydrates. It's basically cake and cookies for bacteria and fungi. And so what happens is these uncountable numbers of microorganisms surround these roots, and they protect the roots. It's their food trough. So the plant is sending all this food, and consequently what happens is the diversity of those organisms surround and protect their food source, which is this plant. If any pathogens come into that system and try to attack the plant, they crowd out that pathogen. So it protects this plant. It's the original pesticide, okay? It's naturally there, which is why when you get a really robust soil food web, your plants don't get attacked because they're super strong and they have all these helpers underground. It's the exact same system that happens in your own gut biota when you have full diversity. Your digestive system, your immune system is super strong. And when you bomb your system with antibiotics, you're vulnerable to all kinds of disease. Same thing in the soil. If you bomb it with chemicals and pesticides and you shut down the system, the plant weakens, it's dependent on you, which increases your labor load, all this negative spiral. So if you feed that system and feed the soil food web, these plants thrive, and this is where it happens. So underground, there's all these predator-prey relationships going on. All these microorganisms are feasting on each other, feasting on the exudates, dying off, leaving detritus in the soil. And that detritus and these dead bodies of trillions and trillions and trillions of organisms is stored carbon that stays there for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is how we sequester carbon in the soil through photosynthetic opportunities. And those microorganisms are constantly protecting these plants, and the plants are actually running the system. And this is why you don't have to go out into a forest and put nitrogen fertilizer on the ground. They're doing it themselves. So all you do to grow food is replicate those systems that are already in place, right? They've been here for 3.6 6 billion years, or the relationships between the trees, the plants, the organisms in the soil is 500 million years old. So you just let that process take place and you're going to be in a beneficial situation. This is a map from National Geo showing the fungal pathways between an average forest system where all the trees are communicating through fungal networks. There's this huge network underground that if you support it, it works. And when you put in, even when you put in fertilizer that's organic, liquid fertilizer from the soil, and you drop it into the soil, it shuts down these relationships. It actually stops having these interrelationships with the bacteria in the soil, and the plant turns upwards and says, oh, I'm getting fed cocaine basically from the surface of the soil. They then become dependent on you for that food. And now you've short-circuited that whole system. And that's what the big difference between industrial ag and organic, because in an organic system, you're replenishing this natural propensity for fertility and carbon sequestration. So the way that leads in to your question about regenerative agriculture is, I'm going to jump right up here. Right now, in industrial agriculture, we're feeding the public with a 10-to-1 carbon ratio. That is to say, we're burning 10 kilocalories of fossil fuels for every kilocalorie of food that ends up in your kitchen. It's tremendously wasteful. It creates 25 to 30% of the greenhouse gases that create anthropogenic climate change. So, and on top of that, once we get our food, Americans throw a third of it away after it's in their kitchen. And we put it typically in petroleum-based plastic bags. It goes to the dump and vents off methane. We're a young species. We're not really catching on to how this system works, but we're starting to. And part of that process is shifting from what we thought technology was originally, which was when we shifted into industrial ag, the thought of more machines and more synthetic chemicals, which obviously is hitting a dead end. Instead, we need to take that definition of technology to the form of technique or behavior or method change. And so there's a lot of reskilling going on. And the best part of that reskilling is called regenerative agriculture. And what the implications for regenerative agriculture, of course, at scale, are amazing when it comes to climate change. It's one of the biggest mitigation behavioral steps we can take. It's present day technology. We don't need to invent anything. So I'm going to go through a few of the steps of how regenerative agriculture relates to climate, if I can. Everybody okay out there?
Yeah, great.
Is this coming through? Okay, so first
Absolutely.
off,
Yep.
these behavioral changes in agriculture, as far as, and what I'm talking about here is organic regenerative, because there's now a new offshoot of just chemical regenerative, which is lesser. The organic regenerative agriculture, I think, is the best focus to work here because of many things. A, you reduce your dependence on any kind of synthetic chemicals. No-till, diverse cover crops, compost, no external nutrients, no pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, and multiple crop rotations. So again, you're going back to the natural systems approach to keeping this soil food web robust. And what happens then, of course, is the roots go deeper. And what do we know? With more healthy roots, more activity under the soil, more carbon sequestration because it's feeding that soil food web that we just talked about. And if you move from the present industrial soils, which are down below 2% roughly of soil carbon, back to 8%, which is still below what I'm running out here, which is over 10% carbon in my soil. But if you move from 2% to 8%, you add up to 50 tons of carbon sequestration per acre per year. That's a huge number. And that's simply by shifting behavior, just getting rid of the chemicals. And of course, what I'm not touching here is the transition and the careful transition from industrial ag lands to get them into regenerative. It's tricky, but it can be done. And we have to support farmers during that transition because it's a scary move for most industrial farmers. They're like, what if my yields go down? And sometimes they do temporarily until that system kicks back in. So we have to support farmers to do that. And that's what regenerative agriculture is about. But as far as carbon sequestration and capture, right now, we're in, we need to mute somebody, there we go. Soil carbon in soil in a natural setting before we started messing with it is greater than all plants and atmosphere combined. So that's a huge number. If you think of all the terrestrial forest on the whole planet and all the carbon in the atmosphere, the soil in the soil or the carbon in the soil is more than those two combined. But in the last 10,000 years, and half of it since 1850, so more recently, we've lost 50% of that carbon through human intervention, turning soils over tillage and letting it blow away and not replacing the carbon back into those soil networks. So we've lost those microorganisms, we've lost that cycling of carbon underground that helps sequester it. So right now, if we take the total global acreage in annual crops, it's about 3 billion acres that humans are growing annual crops in. And if we just shift that amount to regenerative agricultural practices, we can sequester 12 tons per acre per year if we implement all the steps. If you multiply that by 3 billion acres, that's 36 billion tons per year, which equals 360 billion tons over 10 years, which is about what we're putting in anthropogenically. So you can scale this. And if all industrial ag land was miraculously or supported and subsidized so that we could get toward that number, you can sequester between 40 to 80% of annual anthropogenic CO2. But if you add pasture land and add compost to pasture land, you can actually get more than 100% of anthropogenic release of CO2 back into the soil each year. So what this does, and these aren't my numbers, this is from the Rodale Institute, and there's plentiful numbers out there. There's some deviation in the studies because it's an early part of the process, but the advantage is massive. There is nothing else on the planet, there is no lever this big that we can pull to reduce carbon in the atmosphere and put it directly in the soil just using behavioral change. And simply moving compost out onto a landscape, let's say in grasslands or pasture lands, will increase the bioactivity underground, which then increases the carbon sequestration. And you let those systems that have been in play for 500 million years do their thing. They're very good at it. So we just have to figure out how to support farmers, but they can enact the largest potential solution to climate change using bacteria, fungi, and living soil. So it not only happens at scale and is really good from a climate global perspective, but works in your gardens as well. The nice thing is there's no new technology, no infrastructure changes except for behavioral market changes that we can then institute to make this happen. And from a financial perspective, you could provide a $1.9 trillion financial return by 2050 on an investment of approximately 57 billion right now. So, and that data from the financial perspective is from drawdown.org. And if you haven't been to that site, it's fascinating. Paul Hawken put it together a while back. And it's a very non-intuitive list that's hierarchically listed based on the behaviors that have the most effect on not mitigating, but reversing global warming. And this is part of it. If we actually could just shift the behavior of humans on the planet, we can do this. It's not like we have to invent carbon sequestration apparatus. They're called plants, and we have plenty of them. And we have organisms in the soil already that can do that job for us. So it's a fascinating shift of just understanding how the planet works, how the biosphere works, and aligning with those natural systems. And so what happens, again, if we understand these and align with those natural systems, you get these microbes helping you on a human health scale, on a small ag scale, a large ag, industrial ag scale, and climate mitigation. So everything from you understanding diversity in your own system and helping the microorganisms that live in and on your body. The diversity is key to strength of immunity and how you can have foods that support that network, and the same for feeding the soil on the grander scale. And when you do it in your backyard, you get this kind of growth, this kind of robust explosion of expression of life. I mean, it's amazing when you have a very active soil food web. This is the typical response. And there's no chemicals involved in this. There's just compost and recycling and feeding those microbes and getting out of the way, really.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think plenty of the gardeners and aspiring gardeners on the call would be pretty happy to see their garden looking like what you showed there. So we talked a little bit about the sort of gardener side of things, you know, using vermin or worm composting, the importance of watering and so forth, getting rid of the old grass. You did allude to the larger scale part of the equation, which I'm a little bit curious, where do you think we are there? I mean, has anyone that you know of started sort of working on the scale? And to the extent that you've got folks watching this today or watching the recording who are either part of, or maybe larger scale farmers working hundreds or thousands of acres, or perhaps we've got some watchers who are who know or are connected to some of those larger scale farmers. I mean, I'm one of them. I live in Indiana, so this is large scale central here. We've got tons, literally, of
Yeah.
big corn and wheat and soy fields. So that's another theme that has come up in the past. I think most people are more interested in the small scale stuff just because that's of personal interest to a large majority. But you point out that there's a lot of potential in the larger scale ag sector, and to the extent that we've got any of those folks' attention, what's your message there? I mean, are we seeing success? How long does it take? How long might they have to wait before they can see those yields come back up on a sort of a depleted, conventionally farmed soil?
Right. What they're finding, and again, I'm speaking as, am I not hearing myself? Yeah, there I am. As a person that's my focus, my specialty is home scale horticulture. So I'm not doing full scale thousands of acres farming, but I'm intrigued by regenerative agriculture. And for those of you that are connected with that system and want to support that change or do it yourself, I would just go on Google and go regenerative agriculture 2020. There are tons of organizations spawning worldwide, from Australia to North America, India, Asia, et cetera, that are using this and implementing it in force. There are millions and millions of acres doing this worldwide and having tremendous success. There are key steps you need to focus on as you're making the transition. There is also the awareness that, again, when you have a very progressive agenda that's against the status quo, we have 100 years of behavior. There's a lot of equity momentum in the chemical agriculture system. So that mindset is not supporting this transition. It's an outside group of people supporting the transition for farmers because their insurance companies are making it difficult for them if they're not going to use all this chemistry that they're used to buying and GMO seeds and everything else that's part of that system. If they want to do things on their own and start regenerating their lands, there's not, unfortunately, the institutional support from the insurance companies, et cetera. But there's this huge explosion of regenerative agriculture people helping each other grow food. And rather than trying to listen to my ideas about it, simple search can give you 10 or 20 organizations, many of which are around you in the Midwest, in Indiana and Iowa and Kansas, et cetera. It's already happening in your area. So you can tag in, and there are seminars and all kinds of training programs for farmers to jump on board and help regenerate their soils. The key thing is educating the general public. So as we get to a political structure to help subsidize farmers for carbon sequestration, we can all agree to do so, to help farmers out. Not only is it a great lever to help keep farmers in business and keep small towns across farming belts open and regenerate their livelihoods, but also help sequester carbon, of course, for climate mitigation and grow better food. So one thing I do have is more of a textbook, but if people are really interested in getting down into the nitty gritty, I'll hold that up. This is the title. It's the Carbon Farming Solution. And it's now a year or two old, but it's very fresh. This was the first textbook to come out about it. It's pretty dense information. It's, here's the author on the bottom. Eric Tunsmeyer, and a foreword by Hans Herren. Anyway, it's got tons of information. And again, this is changing so fast that even this is the biologic scientific farming kind of manual that came out a couple of years ago, but it's changing so fast that there's probably way more updated information even this year. In the front of this, it's got Paul Hawken and Bill McKibben speaking about there's just tons of really good support of it. Let me get it's actually 3 or 3.5 years old. So, so it's been going for 5 or 10 years, but now it's just blossoming into this huge movement, and they're finding more and more success with it. So that'd be my first guess, because there's so many organizations doing regenerative agriculture and educating farmers now that it changes month to month. So I would just get online, do a quick search, filter it down to your area, and you will find copious support networks to get farmers into that new network.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're at, we got about 20 minutes or a little less, and I thought maybe we would get into some of the questions.
Oh, sure.
And so for the folks on the call, feel free to type some questions into the chat. You'll see a little speech bubble there at the bottom among your various buttons. One of those is the chat, which will bring it up, and you can click that, and it'll bring up the window, and you can type a question into the chat.
So I can see some, and I'll just start reading down. Do I make biochar for soil amendment? I have used it in the past. It's actually a very good soil amendment. I don't necessarily need it because my soil food web is already activated and robust. But what biochar does for gardens that need help jumping up is they create micro living environments and tons of porous materials that then the micro organisms can inhabit, and it keeps them propagating generation after generation. So that's the benefit of biochar, is it provides housing for bacteria and small microorganisms, basically. And it's a sequestered carbon that goes under the ground.
That was my question for you, Tom, in terms of, sort of the home gardener watching. Is biochar something you can typically find commercially, or where does one source that?
You can buy it, but again, it's not necessary. You do not need it. If you do add it, it's a benefit, but it's not necessary. So there are those that are proponents of biochar. I understand what they're doing. I do the same thing with just carbon from local leaves and carbon materials that I compost and put back in the soil. And I have enough porous material in that soil, since it's been enhanced for 20 years with this organic method. It doesn't require extra additional biochar. And what I get across to people is, I try to make methods that are easy, accessible, and you don't have to purchase things. Some things you can purchase a $20 worm bin refrigerator, right, from a junkyard. That's a reasonable purchase. It can be used for 25 years, doesn't cost anything after that. If you are told by someone like me that you got to buy these things, you got to go buy a truckload of biochar, and you got, it's like, well, you don't really have to, but I'm not saying it's bad. It's a wonderful addition to any garden, as many other things are. And it is basically a living environment for bacteria. Let's see, combination of biochar and compost mixed together is fine. It's a bit redundant, but it's fine. Biochar is great with compost. Hi, Tom. When you remove the worm castings, how do you retain your worms and minimize disruption to their little friends? Good question. I do a pyramid approach. You can migrate from your bins, which is putting new food in one side of the bin and leaving the other side drift. And what the worms will do is migrate to the fresh food, and then you just harvest where their old living environment was, where most of the castings remain. That takes about 2 weeks. I'm impatient with that. So what I do is each spring and each fall, I take the entire bin, I put it out on a tarp, and I create pyramids that are about 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall with mounds. So I have like 8 or 10 pyramids on a huge tarp. And sunlight is poisonous to worms. It burns their skin, which is why worms always go underground. So what they do in this pile is they will scatter from this. It has to be done on a sunny day. Just let me say that. So it won't work on a cloudy day. So they escape the sunlight. They go to the bottom center of each one of those pyramids, and you just take your gloves and wipe down layer, layer upon layer. And that is just clean vermicastings. And by the time you get to the bottom of the pyramid, there's this writhing mass of just mostly worms, and that's what you put back in your new clean bin that's prepped with fresh material. And you end up with about 300 pounds in the spring and 300 pounds in the fall, if you're 2 people in a general household, of finished worm castings that then you spread over all your gardens. It helps do amazing things for soil mitigation. Let's see, biochar and compost, yes. Trees also emit carbon through decomposition phase unless the carbon is actually captured. That is true, as well as any kind of bacteria that's breaking down carbon. There is CO2 venting from that process, but it's a fraction of what happens that when we leave it above ground and it oxidizes, or we burn it, or any kind of combustion. So it's much more beneficial. It's helpful. Good. Yeah, it's helpful for you. Do I do a no-dig approach to preserve the microbiome then? I'm not a perfectionist in the no-dig because I live in clay soils in a desert environment, and I find out that I've tried it. I've tested several of my beds side by side, and in my particular microclimate, although I do support the work of the people that are doing no-till, if they can handle it in their microclimate and their soil, I tend to use a broad fork, which minimizes the disruption to that micro system underground in the soil food web, but allows percolation each year. I have very heavy clay soil, so I have to mitigate that. But I just had a member this morning ask me about, why am I so against rototillers? Like, you don't want to disrupt it that much. And if people want to use a rototiller first year out, I get that. And sometimes that's necessary, but you still need to break up what's called the plow pan that happens at the bottom of the blade rotation. It creates this polished hard surface about 1.5 feet down or 2 feet, or depending on how deep your blade is. You have to go and break that up with a fork because it's going to create percolation issues and some growth issues there. But yeah, you're right in the sense that you want to minimize your disruption of that soil food web. How might widespread organic agriculture change our food choices? Are there food crops that are really popular right now and industrially farmed, but not that viable in organic farms? I would say that all the food that makes you healthy is wonderfully available in small plots and reasonable organic agriculture. Most of the stuff that we get from industrial ag is lower nutritional quality because their soils are depleted and they have to add all the nutrients and they're not getting the full spectrum. They're getting NPK, and the rest of it's sterile soil. So it's sort of like enhanced Wonder Bread. Well, if you eat very heavy whole grain bread, you're getting much more of that nutrient load from the grains than you are of Wonder Bread, which is completely bereft of nutrition, that then the scientists have to, or the nutritional scientists have to actually re-add the formula that they believe is helping enhance your nutrition. Well, I'd much rather have the natural organic source of the food. So the closer you get to your wild relatives of those plants, there's a great book on that right now. If this person's concerned about what's the most nutrient dense food you can eat, it's called Eating on the Wild Side. I have it here somewhere, but rather than waste your time, just look that up. And basically it goes to the original wild sources of most of the vegetables and fruits we eat. And it's a woman author who does an amazing job of isolating. If you're gonna eat an apple and you're in the supermarket, if you're not growing the stuff yourself, or if you want to learn which varieties to plant for the highest nutrient density per square foot, this book, Eating on the Wild Side, is wonderful for that. So it shows you of the 36 varieties of apples in your store, here are the 2 you should look for that have the highest nutrient value and the least amount of sugar. We tend to hybridize for scale, the biggest corn and the sweetest corn. So it's sugar content and scale. That's how we've hybridized our original food sources to this gargantuan degree that has lower nutrition per pound. So if you go back to the more bitter greens, let's say, iceberg lettuce is a good example. There's roughage there and very little else compared to arugula, kale, collards, spinach, some of these more bitter brassicas. That bitter tendency is because these are closer to our original wild plants that we started with, and those have higher nutritional value. So I would suggest that we look into those kinds of crops, which aren't being grown in industrial agriculture, but are far more healthy. Like instead of planting straight potatoes like Yukon Gold, that is huge, right? That's how it's so popular. If you planted maybe a Peruvian purple, which is a 4,000-year-old potato that was propagated in the Andes. It's the oldest potato that's been propagated without hybridization. It has more nutrients per pound than any other potato. It stores really well. It's robust at warding off pests and disease. So in that example, you get actually a low glycemic potato. So it's not a high sugar content for people that are battling diabetes, for instance. It's all kinds of other secondary cancer prevention properties to it, et cetera. So we need to look at nutrient-dense foods, not quantity. We tend to be an underfed population that eats too many calories and sugar and processed food, and they have short-circuited their system so that they're not getting the natural chemistry in their own bodies saying, hey, I'm full, I have the nutrients I need. Because the more of this empty calorie food they eat, their body's still looking for nutrition. So they overeat, they get obese, they get heart disease, they get diabetes. It's an eating disorder because we don't understand where nutrient density resides in our food system. So that's a long answer to that question, but I'm rambling a little bit.
I can probably, Tom, before we started the meeting today too, you and I were talking a little bit about sort of the process that happens with gardeners, and I think it may be pertinent to what you were just saying, that it starts with gardening for a lot of people and then moves on to all the other things and all the other activities that you undertake when you become a gardener. And one of those, for example, and your mention of the word wild is what made me think of it, was your storage sort of regime that you do each year to try to keep your crops throughout the winter. And one of those is fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
So that is yet another way that if you start by producing the food, I submit that you probably end up eating better, partly because of the food you're producing is likely to be very nutrient dense and maybe more diverse than the crops that travel well or last longer or are larger for the sort of typical use. But also you start getting into things like canning and fermentation, which once again changes the nutritional profile of the food you're eating. So very fertile territory there, so to speak.
Yeah, so here's a quick shot. Can you see the pantry there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is the type of fermenting and storing and canning that was basically a daily process for most people 100 years ago that we've all kind of drifted away from. So it's a key part of gardening. If you end up with these, this is back in 2001 when I started. So this is 20 years out. I've been kind of setting this behavioral pattern in my own life. The better you get at it, it becomes easier. It just becomes a part of your regime to be able to align with this food coming into your life from your backyard and understanding how to process it, store it, preserve it. I have a solar dryer here that's a really super tool for taking excess crops that are coming in so fast you can't eat them. You just dry everything. And this is like 8 feet wide. I can dump all kinds of sliced vegetables and fruits into this and create food that I can eat for a year or two later on. I actually rehydrated some squash that was 4 years old 2 days ago and had it in a stew, and it was just marvelous. It's amazing how simple food storage can be when you get the hang of it. And while we're on the subject, real quick, for mitigation and climate people, to show how microorganisms are running the biggest climate carbon sequestration system in the world, I did a little proof of concept with, this is what's, it's a wood chip compost hot tub. And so what I did is I took what was part of the waste stream, and I did this 4 years ago, where all the tree trimmers have all these wood chips that they dump every year. And there's copious amounts of them. In a social structure, we tend to throw them out or charge these people to dump these wood chips. Well, I collected them for a summer and let these trucks just dump on my property. It's a layered pile about 12 feet wide, 6 feet tall, that I then insulated with a jacket of leaves. And it basically ran a hot tub at 105 to 110 degrees, 24/7 for 18 months in a row. And that's all generated heat from microorganisms, bacteria in that pile. And basically it's layered in such a way with irrigation pipe that's wound every 10 inches in a simple system. This is an old design that I hybridized to try to do a hot tub. It's been done before in Europe back in the 80s. It's a John Payne system for those of you that are familiar with it. But basically you just cycle simple closed loop water that never touches anything inside the pile. It's just grabbing heat and capturing it, and it runs through that and back into the hot tub. You could just as well heat a greenhouse. You can heat a radiant heat floor for a house. You can use usable heat. Here's a shot of one before I built the pile. There's oxygen flow pipe in the bottom. But basically, it ran me through 2 Colorado winters where I had a hot tub outside for free all winter long at 108 degrees if I wanted it to be 110, which is too hot for me, but you can very simply adjust your flow rate. And overall, I've got workshops on this particular thing because a lot of people use it for heating different things. You had all this wood chips that was going in the waste stream that now creates 18 months of usable heat just via microorganism activity, and had the BTU equivalent of burning 7 cords of wood, but with no combustion. And so I reduced it out of the waste stream. It created, after that 1.5-year process, I threw several thousand worms into that same pile. They finished it off, added a lot of enzymes, and I had finished compost, 30 cubic yards of free compost, which right there is over $1,000 or $2,000, depending on where your market is, of what that turned into plant food. And then I put all that 30 cubic yards of compost back into the 18 beds that then is still growing food because I enhanced the soil food web. So all that heat was used with no or very little CO2 off-gassing, no combustion, usable heat for 1.5 years that you could have heated a house with for 2 winters, or a small, greenhouse or whatever you want to apply it to. And then it turns into plant food. This is the kind of carbon sequestration that microbiology can accommodate. So this on a mass scale is regenerative agriculture in the sense of soils in a different process, but the soils and the exudates in plants helping sequester carbon. So it's a fun experiment. It just shows another type of use of the bioorganisms. So I wanted to kind of show people like that. It aligns with the natural law of return and homeostasis, which is what I think humans need to kind of realign with. So
I'm willing to bet that none of the people on the call today expected to hear the turn of phrase, wood chip compost hot tub.
What's funny is if you put that in Google, I'm the first one. It's like, yeah, random. It's like, it shows up first one on Google.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
It's a good demonstration of how much energy we're talking about, and we're talking about really what amounts to garden waste, or what would be thought of as garden waste, is actually just loaded with energy. And if you just know how to access it, you can use it to create the sorts of energy that we people use, which we call food.
Right, exactly.
So I've been reading some of these other questions, and I know we're almost out of time, but we can maybe cover 1 or 2 others.
Right, I see some.
One of them that I think is on that theme of energy has to do with inputs. Someone's asking, do you really not use any animal products? And you mentioned manure, and I thought to mention to folks just who might be watching this. We have near our garden a horse farm, and so that is a wonderful, wonderful resource for anybody who might have a horse farm hanging around. Usually, those places are drowning in manure and would love to let you have a truckload of it to bring back to your garden field. So, and that is very good stuff. But Tom, with your system, are you bringing any inputs in from outside, or do you just get everything from compost and so forth?
I personally get everything from compost. The only manure in my system is my own 7 laying hens. So it's a very minor component, but I compost the chicken manure, and I mix that in with all my compost bins. So it eventually breaks down. You can't use chicken manure straight out in the garden. It's too hot, too much nitrogen. So you have to buffer it quite a bit with composting. But manure itself isn't bad. It's the human addition of chemistry to that system that is lingering in the manure that's bad, just for qualification there. So if you know your horse farmer or a next door neighbor who feeds their animals organic materials, even in the winter, which is not typical. The problem here locally is in the wintertime, these people say, oh yeah, I know this guy's a horse farmer, he's got great manure. What? And once you start drilling down and asking them, well, what do they eat in the winter? Oh, we get the hay from this farmer over on the mesa. Oh, great. Do you know what that farmer uses? No, I think he's good. I think he doesn't use chemical. Well, you check in with the farmer. Oh, yeah, I use the de-weeding milestone that keeps the weeds down. Well, right there is your transit point, right? Your vector. So that farmer has dry hay that he feeds or sells to this horse farmer who's a super good person, is concerned about health, but doesn't understand the farmer's using all this chemistry that's in the hay that is feeding the horse. Horse excretes the manure. The persistent pesticide is still, or the herbicide is in that manure for 6 years, even in a compost pile. So what happens is the problem with herbicide carryover, which is a really big problem, is as people bring in a bunch of that material, whether it be straw or hay or manure that has this herbicide in it, and they incorporate it into their garden soil, And that season comes out with asymmetric growth and curling of leaves. It's a broad-leaf herbicide. So all of your broad-leaf vegetable plants get hit, and you get this asymmetric, it's the first sign. Like in peas, which I do pea assays, because the pea plant is the first one to actually show if there's any herbicide in that soil. If you just do a little 2-week assay test with a pea seed and let it grow, the first leaves will come up asymmetric and curling, and you'll know, oh, that soil's got some herbicide carryover. And you wouldn't use it, because if you incorporate it into your soil, there's no way to get rid of it. So in Europe, they had to excavate whole gardens, whole CSAs, had to take all the soil out and start over with fresh soil. It was amazing hardship. So that's the reason I tend to avoid manure, not because of the manure itself, but the chemicals. And so if you know someone next door and you know exactly year round what they're feeding that animal, great, go for it, use all that manure. It's a great resource. And it used to be the key resource for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we turned it into this toxic problem because we added chemicals, and that's where we kind of messed up. So we have to back out of that equation. If you can find good manure, go for it. I have nothing against that. But and there is someone in here that asked as far as they want 0 animal products in their food. You can grow food plentifully with just vegetable compost. You don't have to have manure. It just helps create a nice balanced nitrogen load, but you can get that in other areas.
Awesome. Well, we're just a few minutes past the hour, and I want to make sure we're respecting your time. So Tom Bartels, I really appreciate you coming on today. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I'm sure we could fill hours more with it if we had the time. I gather that growfoodwell.com, which you maintain, has a lot of these answers and has more information for anyone who might be interested. Is that fair to say? I've only just been snooping around.
Yeah. It is. We've had a surge of people interested because there's a lot of people growing out there, and we are still accepting students for this spring run. And the workshop is open. It's curriculum-based streaming videos. And right now, based on the whole COVID scenario, I cut everything in half. So it's half off, and you can get in today and start learning. If you're looking for steps to increase yields and reduce your workload and align with natural systems, that's what our program's designed to do. So if you want, rather than cycling through the whole website and looking for stuff at full price, I can give you a shortcut to the half off right now. If people are interested, they can go to growfoodwell.com/spring, SPRING. So growfoodwell.com/spring, and that'll get you directly to a sales page that explains the whole program, see if it's right for you, and you can jump right in if you choose to do so.
Cool. Yeah, I'm sure that'll be a good resource for plenty of folks. And if nothing else, this hour today has been a good resource for me, and I'm sure for the others. So, Tom, thanks for your time. And,
you bet. My pleasure.
We'll see you in the forum from time to time. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for being there, and get out there and grow some food.